It's a special pleasure to welcome today's two speakers and the topic they will be addressing, one which I think has truly a turning point potential for discussions of decolonization today, which despite best intentions, repeatedly runs risks that it should perhaps be more alert to. In the necessary challenging of an entity known as the Global North, postcolonial and decolonial studies have at times come perilously close to generalizing the entity known as the Global South and being inadequately attentive to what Aimé Césaire referred to scathingly as the old tyrannies that got on very well with the new tyrannies of empire. Anti-caste scholarship has at the very least a cautionary note to sound, and beyond that, the potential to change how we think about decolonization. While the caste challenge may be specific to the Indian context, the kinds of questions it raises pertinently and sharply remain relevant to and can be posed of other anti-colonial struggles. Inasmuch as decolonization is still thought of as the self-assertion of singular colonized or formerly colonized entities against the damage or erasure inflicted by colonial powers, oppressed caste self-assertion complicated the binary mode and also complicated what remains a singular focus on sovereignty. To the claims of Indian nationalism, particularly in its Gandhian mode, caste assertion not only asked who spoke for the colonized, but whether those who claimed to do so were in turn culpable of upholding a colonization of their own. Who are the colonized and the colonizers, the oppressed and the oppressors? This is not to uphold in any simple sense the British colonial claim that its rule was necessary to bring uplift to those at the receiving end of native tyranny. It was, however, to state what is both obvious and yet often hidden. Contexts subject to Western colonialism had their own structures of domination and rule, which needed to be interrogated and undone if claims to liberation and political rights were to have substantive meaning. This is broadly the theme the two talks today address themselves to, and we are joined by two outstanding scholars of caste and anti-caste movements, and I will introduce them in the order in which they will speak. So the two speakers in the order in which they are going: Professor Chinnaiah Jangam, who is the author of Dalits and the Making of Modern India, which was published by Oxford University Press in 2017. His translation of Gabbilam or Bat by Guram Joshua, father of Dalit literature in Telugu, will be published as Gabbilam Bat, a Dalit epic by Yoda Press this coming April. He is currently Associate Professor in the Department of History, Carleton University in Canada. His research and writing, in his own words, seeks to illuminate the histories of marginalization and resistance through the lens of Dalits. It attempts to construct an historical narrative of anti-caste epistemology as a stepping stone to an ethical and egalitarian world. Dr. Karthick Ram Manoharan, our second speaker, is the author of Frantz Fanon, Identity and Resistance, which came out with Orient Black Swan in 2019. And he is the co-editor of Rethinking Social Justice, which came out in 2020. His monograph, Periyar, a study in political atheism, is forthcoming with Orient Black Swan in early 2022. He is currently the Marie Sklodowska-Curie Research Fellow at the University of Wolverhampton, where he is working on the political thought of Periyar E.V. Ramaswamy. He has a website, which is https://theperiyarproject.com, and I think it's well worth a look. It features select translations of key works by Periyar, as well as short articles from academics and intellectuals on his ideas and their relevance today. So with no further ado, may I introduce our first speaker, Professor Jangam. Over to you.
Thank you, Priya, and also Stuti and Avni, and also fellow panelist Karthik. And I'm so glad, and Jai Bhim to you all. Let me put my screen up. Just I'm going to this slideshow. Are you able to see my 1 minute? I just wanted to make sure I'm on slides. Okay, yeah. Thank you again, Priya, for inviting me for this very important conversations. And basically the talk today I am giving is part of the larger project I'm writing on the history of caste, long duration history of caste in South Asia, particularly the way in which caste has been, transformed over the centuries and how it became a central defining feature of Indian subcontinent. So in this context, these, what I'm presenting today, I also presented earlier at Stanford University and University of Pennsylvania. And this is again an extension of what I'm doing as part of my larger book project. And all the conversations here will really help me in terms of refining my book and also add to my existing critical engagement with the caste. So, sorry. So when we think about caste, one of the important things about caste is that, like many times, like till recent times, the caste has been seen as this, existed in the past as no relevance to the present. So in this context, even the way in which the caste erasure happened in the context of India itself as politics to it. And I think one of the important defining moment in terms of erasure of caste in India is that the death of Ambedkar. Till Ambedkar was alive, and one of the important things about is that, Ambedkar, with his critical engagement with Gandhi and the Congress-led national movement, he made it a point the caste to exist as a very important frame of debate. Politically, what had happened that, as some of you might be familiar with the Pune Pact of 1932 and afterwards the development and Ambedkar's role in the constitution, in drafting the constitutions. One of the important thing is that, he made it a point to keep the caste as a very important, political agenda of Indian national movement. And not only Ambedkar, Dalits across India voiced this, and also Karthik will talk about afterwards about the role of Periyar in terms of, Dravidian politics and other things. But what you see is that, politically, after the death of Ambedkar, caste has been subsumed within this nationalist euphoria and Gandhian nationalist politics. So to use the word, actually it's origin politics, which basically it gets subsumed into. Analytically also, one of the important thing is that, once Ambedkar stopped writing about the importance of caste, what you see is that, in post-independent India, like it is nationalist histories and communist histories, which became very important. If you're familiar with 1960s and 70s, the kind of histories have written about India's past, what you see is that, both had a contempt towards caste. So in this context, what you see is that, effectively till 1990s anti-Mandal protests, what you see is that, caste was never seen as an important, category of analysis, nor a politically important, project. So in this context, I think anti-Mandal politics, what it did is that, it brought the caste, the forgotten caste, back into the political agenda of the nation. So with this, what you see is that, 1990s, in many ways, is a very important decade, which basically at one level we see that Hindu fundamentalism has taken birth. At other level, you see that, anti-Muslim, like with the Babri Masjid destruction, what you see is that, the whole idea of Mandal Kamandal and the politics have reshaped the modern India. So in this context, what you see is that, caste at one level was erased, but what you see is that because of the resilience of the anti-caste thinkers and also the people who were educating at this time, one of the important things is that, caste always remained as an important factor in terms of political, socio-economic, and economic marginalization. So in this context, what you see is that, to give you an overview, basically, caste is a template of power, template in terms of, the way in which socio-economic structure gets organized, on which basically historically, that's what one of the important argument I'm trying to make is that, the civilizational roots of Indian subcontinent were founded on the basis of caste. And what you see is that, unlike, whatever the political transformations have happened in terms of dynasties fall, coming and going, and also different, eras, what you see is that, the structural frame or template, remain the same. And if you really want to see, one of the important things is that, if you you look at Brahmin, always remained on the top, despite the challenges, Buddhism, Jainism, various kinds of anti-caste movements which challenge the Brahmanism. Despite all that, Brahmin always remained on the top. And similarly, what you see is that, untouchable always, the Dalit always remained as is opposite. So in this context, what you see is that the fundamental template of caste remained as a very important feature of Indian history. But what you see is that, the scholarship, the writings on Indian history, particularly the historically or even sociological work, other things, what you see is that, they all ignored this template as the foundational, structure on which other forms of institutions, culture, and ideas have evolved. And bringing this out is a very important challenge. So that's why what you see is that, caste, why is it very important? Precisely because, like many times in the West, people do not have understanding of caste. And what you see, the caste is by birth. And another important thing is that, unlike what we see that, only 4 varnas we talk about. Like, when we talk about the way in which caste has evolved in terms of varna system and afterwards jatis, and before the European encounter, caste was, existing in 2 frames. One is varna, another one is jati. And caste is basically, it exists in plural terms. And within varna, what you see that there are hundreds and thousands of castes. And with this, one other important aspect is that graded hierarchy is very, very critical in terms of the way in which caste system operates. And the principle on the basis of which it operates is purity and pollution. And this purity and pollution is very, very critical, because what you see is that, it basically divides the respect and dignity to human beings incrementally. Like, you purity attributed to the top and, pollution attributed to the bottom. In this context, what you see is that, you have this very interesting structural frame which exists as a very important feature of both political and social structure in India. Which again, what you see is that, I gave this interlocking, gears symbol precisely because what you see is that, caste acts as a very important, this interlocking gears in which basically the entire mechanism of Hindu caste system operates in relation to each other. So like, you cannot define, caste is not singular, it is plural. And you can always, it always exists in relationship to the other. And other is always a very important way in which you define your own self. That's why what you see is that, in which what you see that in defining and codifying it, again, we are all familiar. If you're familiar with the South Asian history, the role of Manu Dharma Shastra, particularly the Smriti literature, or even for that matter, Puranas, like, our epics, like Mahabharata and Ramayana. One of the important things is that, the whole idea of dharma and karma is very, very critical. The dharma and karma revolves around this preservation of caste system as a very important duty of the ruler. Like, if you look at Ram Raja, or even for that matter, say Krishna, for example, Pavitranaya sadhunam vinashaya durishkrutam dharma samsthapanarthaya. So what you see is that, every, in Mahabharata, if you look at the whole shloka is about returning back to whenever there is a threat to this whole idea of karma dharma. What you see is that God is reborn. The Krishna rebirths himself to protect that system. So in this context, what happens is that, the whole Kurukshetra war is, if you look at the violence is very, very critical in this. And in this, another important thing is that, role of women is very, very, women becomes very important. Control over women's sexuality is very critical to the preservation of caste purity. That's what you see is that, inter-caste marriages and inter-dining are prohibited to preserve this. In this, what happens is that, like again, the Brahmin always plays a very important role through moralizing and philosophizing caste as a very important dharma, in which basically as knowledge preservers, they play a critical role. So with this, what you see is that, another important thing is that, denial of education also very, very critical in terms of preservation of caste system. Thus, what you see is that, till colonial encounter, like many of, untouchables do not have access to education, and also similarly, many of the Shudra castes. And with this, look, what we are seeing is that Brahmanism, which evolves itself into Hinduism in modern times, one of the important things that, this is what the Hinduism as a religion, what you see is that, caste becomes very, very important. No Hindu will exist without caste. If someone says that I do not have a caste, it's a false pretension. And many times what you see that the so-called, Marxists in India had this very interesting thing when we were, I was in JNU, HCU and everywhere. One of the things is that many people deny that they have caste, but they have privilege, which comes out of their caste. That is what brings them to these institutions and power. So in this context, what is that Hinduism, because it evolved as a very important structural and political philosophy. One of the important things is that the caste is the basis. There is no conversion, because conversion is you cannot basically convert to into Hinduism. That's why when Hindu right particularly we claim makes a lot of pride about it that ours is the only religion which doesn't convert, because you cannot convert because there is no scope for conversion in Hinduism. If you want to become Hindu, which caste you will give to a white man or a person who is coming from outside? So in this context, what you see is that caste as a defining or fundamental structure, what you see is that it also seeps into other religions, Islam, Christianity, and Sikhism, whichever the religion which took root in India. What you see is that you always have caste system like Pashmanda Muslim movement, lower caste Muslims in North India. These days are fighting about caste discrimination within Islam, or even for that matter in Sikhism. For example, in Canada, we have this very interesting problems between Jat Sikhs and Dalit Sikhs. Like it exists everywhere. So in this context, what you see is that Dalits as a in this context, caste, when it becomes very important defining feature, one of the important thing is that it also denies to preserve the caste privilege. What you see is that wealth and education are denied not only for lower people coming from oppressed caste, but also to women, because women are very central in terms of preserving caste status and purity. And with this, what you see that in India, like since caste is a structure, pyramid structure, the lowest people are always in numerical majority. And that's why you see that there are nearly 300 million Dalits in India who constitute nearly 20% of the population. And with this, when it comes to the context of colonialism, what you see is that this is where, like at one level, colonial encounter is very, very important in terms of how caste reshapes itself or takes new avatar. One of the important things that the Europeans in the early stages, particularly British, not Portuguese. Portuguese were very, very conscious about their caste, preserving the caste system. For example, if you see in Goa, most of the early converters were upper caste people, particularly Brahmins. They were after Brahmins for conversation. Ananya Chakravarti's work very interestingly illustrates about this. And what you see is that the early stages of British colonial encounter, one of the important things is that they were blind to the caste. That's why what is that if you look at David Washbrook work, like he has this very interesting golden age of pariah. There is an interesting essay about how early stages of colonialism, when they have come, like when particularly British and others have encountered, like the healthy bodies were among untouchable people. That's why they were, what you see is that they were recruited into British armies. And that's why in the context of Ambedkar also, Ambedkar family comes from military background, Mahar battalions. And the early people who entered into this military service were Dalits, like Mahars and other, even in Madras presidency, large number of untouchable communities or Shudra communities have entered into this military service in colonial companies. And with this, but what you see is that once the colonialism consolidated, like what you see that it has a very interesting alliance with Brahmanism. That's when you see that untouchable recruitment to British armies gets stopped in 19th century. In fact, one of the important representations Ambedkar continuously argued about is that military service should be open to Dalits, because that's a way in which it gives them scope in terms of employment and also education and also dignity in terms of the occupation. So with this, what you see is that the colonialism, what it does is that the whole idea of Orientalist obsession about the Sanskrit language, the Indo-European languages. You might have heard about how basically translation project is very important part of reification or glorification of Sanskrit traditions. So with this, what you see is that the revival of Sanskrit, classical Sanskrit, one of the important things is that it revives Brahmanism and Brahminical view of the world. So with this, again, what you see is that colonialism basically in their alliance with the Brahmanism, when they reproduce the structural caste restructure, and what you see is that it helped them in a very effective way. That's why what you see that assimilation of upper caste into the colonial structures of administration was very, very critical to the governance of colonial India. Because that's why, because of that, what you see is that the extraction of surplus was so easy, like unlike in North America, where you have seen this genocide of indigenous population, and also even Southern America, where you have millions and millions of indigenous populations were killed. But in South Asian subcontinent, we don't see this mass extermination of indigenous population, because caste structure acts as a very important way to efficient extraction of surplus. Because the project of colonialism is a profit, right? They are not there for some humanitarian mission. So because for them, at the end of the day, how efficiently they can extract the surplus, both agriculture surplus, cotton textiles, and whatever. In the early colonial encounter is about selling Indian goods in world markets. So that's why what you see is that in fact, the very idea of the global resurgence of Indian economy in the early modern era is relied on unfree labor and unpaid labor. So with this, what you see is that caste is a very, very important template in this. So therefore, what happens is that colonialism plays a very important role in reintroducing or reframing the caste in a Brahminical way. So with this, what you see is that if that is the way in which colonialism reproduces, what you see is that sociological, anthropological understanding of caste. What you see is that it starts with colonial engagement with caste, but when you come into this whole idea of sociology, which basically the sociology and anthropology as part of the colonial modernity, when both self-understanding and also understanding of the other, when it involves, what you see is that most of the sociological work produced in India has two ways in which they try to do. One, Emile Durkheim's functionalist or Max Weber modernist frame, in which basically what you see that one level, like famously Homo Erectus by Louis Dumont, it tries to produce the status and power. Similarly, what you see is that Max Weber also in modernist frame, at one level, Max Weber's one of the important thing is that capitalism and Protestant ethic, where basically tries to say that the without any reference to colonialism and empire, they don't take cognizance of how the overseas colonies are very important for the development of capitalism. They only talk about this whole idea of producing ideological consent in terms of Protestant ethic, religious ethic as a very important part of the development of capitalism. Similarly, what happens is that the sociological work in India also, take Louis Dumont, M.N. Srinivas, or any other famous sociologists in India who have tried to understand. What they did is that they only produced this using these Western frames, the whole idea of organism, the way in which the operational mechanism of caste, in which basically, like Dumont particularly talks about this consensus model, in which basically people agree to their status, like as though always, but that's not the true. Like if you look at the historical anti-caste development, or even for that matter, the way in which anti-caste ideas have evolved as an alternative or parallel ideas, one of the important thing is that like sociological writings or sociological engagements did not take cognizance of existence of anti-caste spirit among oppressed sections of society. Like in fact, that doesn't even come into the cognizance of this sociological engagement. So with this, what we are seeing is that at one level sociological work reproduce status quo, and at other level what you see is that the 1980s onwards, if you're familiar with the development of subaltern studies, for example, in India or Indian subcontinent, one of the important projects it tries to see, like the founding statement by Ranajit Guha, where basically he critiques both colonial and nationalist elites who have ignored the voices of the so-called subalterns. And what you see that, like, and also like, afterwards you see that Bernard Cohen and also Nicola Dirks and others who have engaged, what they try to do is that they implicate colonialism as an important source of caste. That's true. Colonialism played a very important role, but caste was not the handiwork of colonial state. It was the handiwork of much more thousands of years of Brahminical ideology. So in this context, what happens is that like at one level, like you see that post-colonial studies challenged colonialism and empire, but what they do is that they're only anti-colonial but not anti-caste. And in this context, what we see is that and so another important thing is that the post-colonial writings, most of them are in English, are meant for European academics. None of them are writing for the subaltern public. So in this context, what happens is that at one level, ideologically, they claim to represent this so-called radical subaltern voice. That subaltern category itself doesn't capture the experience of the real subalterns. Who are the actual subalterns? Adivasis, Dalits, and Shudras. Their voices do not represent in this. And in this context, what happens is that by critiquing the colonialism, one of the important things is that in this cultural valorization of indigenous or so-called the non-Western tradition, it actually empowered the Hindu right agenda, particularly in Indian subcontinent. So what you see, another important thing, that it also absolves the Brahminism and privileged castes of their complicity in the exploitation of the oppressed caste sections of society, and also in the perpetuation of caste. And another important thing is that post-colonial studies do not talk about the existence of caste in pre-colonial India. So with this, what you see is that you have this very problematic engagement of post-colonial studies. So at one level, the post-colonial study or the epistemology, if you can call, and one of the important things is that it challenges the Enlightenment reason and the colonial modernity. But what happens is that it also strengthens the Enlightenment project. In what way is that because what happens is that at one level, as we said, the writing of post-colonial studies essentially is in either mostly in English, and the post-colonial reason remains as a very important guiding principle for them. Like if you look at works of Partho Chatterjee, like for example, he talks about nation as a derivative discourse, in which basically again it takes inspiration from the European nation states. And other level, if you talk even, for example, the famous article by Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak, where basically she talks about, can the subaltern speak? And she says subaltern cannot speak, because subaltern is essentially trapped within the colonial reason and colonial modernity. But that's not true. The subaltern speaking outside the colonial domain, they were not able to see that where subaltern exists. Despite her, she basically Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak translated very famous Bengali novelist, and very all those things. Despite all that, she did not go out of it. Similarly, Dipesh Chakravarti is provincializing Europe. At one level, it challenges the Enlightenment reason and everything, but what happens is that it fits itself within that reason, Enlightenment reason. It doesn't really undo or dismantle that. So in this context, what we see is that the way in which the post-colonial critique sounds very radical, but if you see it from the point of view of Dalits or anti-caste frame, they are not radical at all. They are status quoist, especially if you see it from the point of view of South Asia. So in this context, what you see is that like again, the very important possibility, like in the context of what I'm writing, anti-caste, like basically long durable history of caste, one of the ways in which I'm trying to retrieve the history of caste in a very critical manner is using the ancient Indian historians, particularly D.D. Kosambi, you might be very familiar, who is, I think, after Ambedkar, I think it is D.D. Kosambi who had tried to look at a very critical relationship between caste and the way in which the Marxist analysis of class. So in this context, people like him are very, very critical. Similarly, like R.S. Sharma, like Shudras in Ancient India, he has a very interesting book. Romila Thapa, again, Suvira Jaiswal, and Aloka Parashar Sen. These are very interesting historians who try to look at the Sanskritic tradition, engage critically with Sanskrit tradition, also they try to.
Hi, we've lost Chinnaiah. Are you there?
Yes, I am here. Can you hear me?
Yeah, something went wrong for a second there. Now we can hear you.
So that's what I am also hearing some sound. I
Yeah,
thought,
now it's good. It's okay now. Yeah,
yeah.
sorry, carry on.
Yes.
Another 5 minutes or so?
That's right. So
Okay,
like, what you see is that, what we are seeing is that, the ancient Indian historians are very, very important. And also what you see is that, if you really want to, again, to retrieve the history of, write the history of caste, and especially from the point decolonizing caste, one of the important things we have to see is that, see caste from below, not from top. And one of the important things is that, like as you might be familiar with existential philosophy by Jean-Paul Sartre and others, phenomenology, where they talk about this very important aspect of looking, seeing through the view from the perspective of the disadvantaged. And in this context, what you see that, if you look at what history, like from ancient to even all the way up to modern era, one of the important things is that the anti-caste tradition always remained as a very important challenge to Brahmanism from the beginning. Like if you're familiar with Charvaka philosophy, or even for that matter Jainism, Buddhism, like if even in regional languages, like Kannada and Telugu, I can tell you the early Kannada and early Telugu texts were mostly written by Jain philosophers, Jain translators. And similarly, what you see is that, like it always conceptually and also philosophically, Brahmanism always challenged by, the caste oppressed people. So in this context, across historical timeline, what you see is that, it's very easy to see, like, the way in which, like, for example, using the tools provided by the Western writers, like, for example, Michel de Certeau, Practice of Everyday Life, who talks about, very fascinatingly about the importance of cultural tools to challenge the dominance. And Dalis always did that. And in modern India, again, we'll hear about Periyar. Even before that, we see that Pule and Ambedkar and many others. What you see is that, and early modern India, Pothuli Veer Brahma, and also Yogi Vemana in Telugu, for example, are very, very important people who challenge Brahmanism using reason and rationality. That's very, very important. What are the frames they are using? Like, if you look at Enlightenment philosophy, we always talk about reason and rationality as a very important way to challenge dogmatism. But that, anti-caste philosophers always did that. And in fact, if you see regional language literature across, that's what you see that. And with this, what you see is that, how do we decolonize? The decolonization, the project of decolonization happens, one thing, challenging the Western, the colonial narratives. The second one is de-Brahmanize history. De-Brahmanizing history is very, very important. And also the another important tool to rewrite the histories of caste, or the decolonizing caste, is critical race theory. Like particularly if you look at the works by even for example Charles Mills, who wrote this Racial Contract. Very fascinating, like how, like if you look at, there are many African American philosophers and activists who have written extensively, James Baldwin, or you talk about anyone for that matter. So, and I think bringing this together, the tools of decolonization in terms of de-Brahmanizing and challenging the Western epistemology and using critical race theory are very, very critical in terms of retrieving and rewriting the history from the point of view of the oppressed caste society, oppressed caste people. So in this context, what you see is that, that's why it's very important to see how caste, race, and gender are very, very intricately linked in evolution of what the whole idea of the modern societies, in which basically gender-based oppression and race-based oppression and caste-based oppression are very critical to reformulation of these political ideologies. So in this context, what you see is that, if you really want to write a critical history or a critical, studies of, caste, one of the important ways is that, bringing these tools as a very into conversation is very, very important. And thank you. I will stop it here. Thank you, Priya, for this opportunity. And I will wait for that.
That was amazing. Really, really wonderful, Chinnaiah. Thank you very much. I think we'll, before we take questions, which we'll take together, we'll move on to Karthik. And so over to you then, Karthik.
Yeah, okay. Am I loud and clear? Perfect, okay. So thank you, Chinnaiah, for the excellent presentation. So I hope to cover some points on Periyar, which I hope will complement your own presentation. And thank you so much to Priya, Stuti, and Avani for organizing this and for inviting me here. I'm really delighted to be here. I wish it was in person, but yeah, so hopefully some point in the near future. So without much further ado, let me just start with my presentation. So I'm going to discuss Periyar's critique of Indian anti-colonial nationalism. So, I mean, Periyar has been frequently and even now branded as an anti-national and as a colonial collaborator. And this often affects people trying to pursue research or doing something concrete on Periyar in India. But it wasn't Periyar alone who was this lone voice, who was, critical of Indian nationalism. He had his predecessors. At an Indian level, the most obvious predecessor in time to Periyar was Mahatma Jyotirao Phule. So I'll just talk about him very briefly here. So Phule was very strongly opposed to Lokmanya Tilak and his idea of Swaraj. In fact, Phule called in his classic work Slavery, Phule called the anti-colonial struggle a result of the upper caste poisoning the minds of the ignorant masses. And further, he also praised the British for rescuing the masses from the slavery of the elite caste. In Tamil Nadu, in Periyar's home state, there was this Dalit thinker called Ayodhidas, who was quite openly suspicious of Swadeshi. Towards a non-Brahmin millennium, written by Geeta and S.V. Rajadurai, they argue that Ayodhidas saw the nationalist movement as one led by Brahmins to thwart the good governance of the British, which he believed led to the opening up of spaces for oppressed castes. Much later, the Madras Adi Dravida Janasabha said in a statement on 20 December 1917, and my source is the Times of India's archives, that they were subjugated by the Aryan Hindus and that the British rule contributed to their empowerment. And I quote their statement: "The Britishers in India, government officers, merchants, and last but not least, Christian missionaries, love us and we love them in return," end quote. They expressed their opposition to Home Rule and the Congress for being dominated by and favoring the Brahmins. Now, 1917 is the same time, pretty much the same time, when the non-Brahmin movement was launched and its vehicle, the Justice Party, entered the political fray, who also had similar opinions. Now, this was sort of the political context in which Periyar made his entry. Now, before going into what Periyar had to say, let me just slightly digress and move to a text which is considered to be a seminal work of secular Indian nationalism, The Discovery of India by Jawaharlal Nehru. Now, to Nehru, Indian history is an unproblematic teleology which moves from antiquity to modernity. Nehru did not have an intellectual problem in conceiving the people in the Indian subcontinent as constituting one nation with one civilizational continuity. I quote Nehru: "Some kind of dream of unity has occupied the mind of India since the dawn of civilization. That unity was not conceived as something imposed from outside, a standardization of externals or even of beliefs. It was something deeper, and within its fold, the widest tolerance of belief and custom was practiced, and every variety acknowledged and even encouraged." In Nehru's view, we see in the past some inner urge towards synthesis, that this was the dominant feature of the Indian cultural and even racial development. And this was brought about by, according to Nehru, the Sanskrit texts, mainly the Vedas, this synthesis. Interestingly, Nehru's ideological nemesis, the Hindu nationalist demagogue V.D. Savarkar, also based his claims for the Hindus being a nation on more or less the same premises. Now, I'm definitely not equating the two. And I should say, despite my criticisms, I have huge respect for Nehru, and I think it is absolutely significant that the secular institutions which Nehruvian India built have withstood so much assaults from the Hindu right. Many other states in the South Asian region have not been able to withstand the assaults of fundamentalist movements. But having said that, this does not excuse Nehru from a sort of critical inquiry that we have towards other thinkers in the Indian subcontinent. Now, why I think this is important is because mainstream Indian nationalist historiography and debates about Indian history, whether secular or not, have more or less uncritically accepted the idea of India as a single socio-cultural entity called nation. In a perceptive note, Perry Anderson remarks that such intellectuals share the rhetoric of the Indian state and uphold four central tropes from the official imaginary of India, namely antiquity, continuity, diversity, unity, massivity, democracy, multi-confessionality, and secularity. Further noting that there was never a singular political cultural entity called the Indian nation prior to the arrival of colonialism, Anderson argues, and I quote him, the idea of India was essentially a European, not a local invention, as the name itself makes clear. No such term or equivalent as India existed in any indigenous language. In a similar way, Periyar also disputes the existence of an Indian nation in history. And I quote Periyar from an article written in 1967. Can anyone say that the formation of the Indian Union and the formation of the Indian law happened in an organic fashion without a great fraud? Can anyone say that India is not an artificial creation? And since when has a nation called India existed? To Periyar, India, the idea of the Indian nation, Indian nationalism and its symbols were part of a Brahmanical ideological device to rule over the oppressed caste. Questioning the concept of an Indian nation, Periyar argues that it was only under the period of colonialism that the southern region was brought together under an Indian entity, and he called for a critical interrogation of all nationalist symbols. In Periyar's perspective, colonialism and anti-colonialism and the resultant Indian nationalism were phases of history. His greater concern as such was with social institutions which had a greater endurance in history, most notably caste and patriarchy. As early as 1925, he made his priorities clear, arguing that self-respect, especially for oppressed castes and women, is more important than self-rule. He emphasized that the demand for self-rule must be postponed till a self-respecting society was achieved. Now, to make another digression to a thinker on whom I have spent considerable time researching, Frantz Fanon. Now, Fanon was acutely aware of the problems that an elitist leadership leading anti-colonial struggle might cause in a post-colonial society. And he was also critical of anti-colonialism that takes only the form of nationalism without aiming to move to a broader social consciousness. All of this is from the Wretched of the Earth. However, what I identify as a limitation of Fanon is that he takes the political sovereignty of the decolonizing or the decolonized nation to be more or less sacrosanct, and he saw separatist and regionalist demands as such as just colonial maneuvers to destabilize the process of decolonization. Periyar, however, saw that territorial sovereignty of India to be cemented by the exact same colonial structures that the nationalists claim to oppose. While to Fanon, decolonization was a precondition to the acceptance of the relativism of different cultures, to Periyar, the recognition of the existence of fundamentally different cultures and the recognition of multiple forms of oppression within these cultures was the precondition to the acceptance of decolonization. Periyar was extremely critical of essentialized notions of an Indian nation and instead proposed a Dravidian identity based on reason, argument, and shared solidarity against native oppressors and all forms of oppression. Periyar, one could say, shared a Schmittian skepticism that, and I quote Carl Schmitt, "It is a dangerous deception when one single group pursues its special interests in the name of the whole and unjustifiably identifies itself with the state," end quote. Periyar was aware of the distinctiveness of the pre-colonial history of his region and was convinced that the Indian nation-building project was designed to protect the interests of the upper caste and their cultural and political hegemony. And as far as Tamil Nadu was concerned, Periyar understood, and I quote MSS Pandian, "The colonial public sphere was restricted in its scope and substance not merely because of the dynamics of colonialism, but also by the very character of the indigenous elite who participated in it. Without being informed by notions of substantive citizenship, it was an elite who were, by and large, unwilling to relinquish their traditional modes of semi-feudal authority and hence failed to speak for a broader public," end quote. Hence, the central thrust of Periyar's political discourse was to create an alternative public sphere which would challenge the native elites and provide spaces for voices silenced by the nationalist discourse. The Dravidian identity he espoused was, one could say, a resistance identity. I'm taking from Manuel Castells here, as opposed to the legitimizing identity of Indian nationalism. Given the threat he perceived from unmediated hegemony of upper caste in the post-colonial India, Periyar argued that regionalism would be the only permanent safeguard against the political domination of the native elite. Now, the meta-narrative of Indian anti-colonialism in general displayed a gross insensitivity to historical and socio-political questions of caste and region, as rightly pointed out by Chinnaiah. Opposition to regionalism and caste-based demands kept recurring not just in Indian nationalist discourse, but also in Indian historiography and sociology as well. For instance, G.S. Gurye, a well-known Indian sociologist, wrote as early as 1950 that, and I quote Gurye, "Where it is a question of engendering a feeling of unity, the people must be made to cooperate irrespective of caste," end quote. To those like Gurye and many who followed him, the British were responsible for introducing caste divisions in Indian society as a divide and rule strategy, and that the nationalist discourse led by the elite caste was justified in projecting a homogeneous Indian nation in the name of anti-colonialism. Now, even now in debates on caste, we can see that this similar arguments are repeated in many opinions that pass themselves off as decolonial. So Periyar's opinion, however, stands in direct contrast in that he accuses the upper caste, the Brahmins particularly, of being the initiators of the divide and rule strategy. And further, he also accuses the colonial powers of collaborating with the native elites for a smooth functioning of the administrative apparatus. In a polemical fashion, he wrote in 1938, "What is happening now is not British rule, it is the rule of the priests of the Varna system. Its each living breath intends to enslave the Tamil people." Periyar further argues that the Brahminical castes were seeking to dominate the South through Hinduism and Hindi, and that anti-colonialism was a garb through which the Brahmins are trying to retrieve their rule, their religion, and their language. However, Periyar was not the only person opposing Hindi hegemony. There were the Tamil nationalists of his period who also opposed Hindi imposition. But where the Tamil nationalists countered the imposition of Hindi with claims of antiquity and superiority and purity of the Tamil language, Periyar had no such romantic notions about the native language. He was as blunt enough to call Tamil a barbaric language, and he also lamented that there was no Tamil version of Kemal Ataturk, the Turkish leader whom he admired a lot, who could substitute the classic Tamil script with the Latin alphabet. Periyar indicated a marked preference for English, insofar as he considered English to be a universal language, a language of modernity and enlightenment. He, however, was not a speaker of English, and he often required a translator to convey his thoughts. So, anyway. And Periyar also welcomed some liberating effect some aspects of colonialism had on women in the Tamil society. In a comment on the role of native national culture and its effects on women, he writes, "To state it frankly, we are still living according to values established in barbaric times," end quote. Arguing that the spread of English education contributed to the spread of modern egalitarian values with respect to the women's question, Periyar asserts that the white man banning sati and providing women access to modern education was one of the reasons of the anti-colonial movement, which wanted to preserve traditional reactionary values. Now, we can find some similar opinions in the work of Uma Chakravarti's gendering caste as well, on how the nationalist elites opposed, moves by the colonial government to bring about women's reforms, banning sati, the Devdasi system, and so on. In Periyar's perspective, the Brahminical culture, the influence of religion, and Tamil patriarchy all contributed to the oppression of women. And women were better off westernized than relying on native social cultural values for liberation. Where many anti-colonialists of his time considered native dress codes, including Fanon to some extent, Fanon's view in Algeria unveiled, where he views the veil as an act of resistance against French colonialism. But however, many people who cite this essay often forget that Fanon also believed that once decolonization was on its way, women would voluntarily abandon the veil and, enter society as modern liberated subjects. So both the defenders and opponents of the veil might have some issue to take with Fanon over here. But anyway, in India as well, in Tamil Nadu as well, there was the sort of insistence that, native dress and native cultural codes were an act of resistance against colonialism. But Periyar condemned them as regressive and asked women to adopt Western attire for greater mobility. Whether this was right or wrong is subject to debate, but one of the practical effects of Periyar's discourse as regarding women could be seen in that, and I quote S. Anandi over here, "The women members of the self-respect movement not only participated in the non-agitational programs of the movement like conferences, but also quite actively in mass agitations," end quote. Not just that, women from the most marginalized sections, like the Devdasi communities or the hereditary performer communities, also became active participants in social reform movements in the state. These women took part in anti-caste struggles, the anti-Hindi agitations, and protests demanding greater social and economic rights for women. Periyar's discourse also involved a critique of terms, linguistic terms, that he considered patriarchal in the Tamil language. For instance, he launched a devastating attack on the dominant notions of chastity that existed in the period that placed several social restrictions on women. To Periyar, these outdated notions of community that sought to exercise sexual control over the bodies of women were remnants of barbaric times. He further lampooned Tamil scholars and poets for expecting women to be chaste while placing no such demands on men. Periyar was not averse to attacking ancient Tamil poetry and classics exalted by the Tamil nationalists for their sexism and misogyny. He was convinced that any ideology that places the past, any past, at a high pedestal was likely to be oppressive. And this applied double for glorifying pre-colonial pre-modern past. Now, I'll just move to certain, since the topic is about decolonization, and there are some powerful critiques of academic decolonization, or how decolonization is, being used in a sort of a loose way now in the academia. Can we ask if it has become an ideological term which masks something else and is of no meaning to what it might have meant at one point of time? Now, there's, of course, excellent recent work, which many of you might be familiar with, by Eve Tuck and Wayne Yang, Rahul Rao, and of course, Priyamvada Gopal herself, that addresses the problems of the use of the term decolonization within the current setting. Can one say that by culturalizing decolonization, it has become just another catchy metaphor that sounds radical but means little more than inclusion and diversity, which is perfectly compatible with a neoliberal frame? I leave it open. Political decolonization, on the other hand, as imagined by Fanon, called for a physical ending of colonial rule and colonial structures. It also wanted to challenge native elites and compradors in the post-colony. Likewise, Fanon also emphasized the movement from a national consciousness to a social consciousness, imagining a new humanism. With someone like Samir Amin saw decolonization as a stand-in for a third world Marxism, and he also was strongly critical of the rise of religious and ethnic identitarian movements in the third world. However, there is something left to be desired in Samir Amin's work at times when he spoke positively of the Cambodian regime under Pol Pot. So that's a big question mark on Samir Amin's third world Marxism. And finally, a theorist who I am engaging with is Mahmoud Mamdani. And in his recent work, Neither Settlers Nor Natives, he addresses the challenge of decolonizing the political, and I quote him, he calls it stripping away the nation or the tribe as nation as a locus of political identification and commitment. And he suggests delinking the state from the nation and imagining a new political community in the place of the nation. Now, where does the Periyarist critique stand in all of this? Now, in a Periyarist perspective, nationalism privileges the most privileged. Indian nationalism privileges the upper caste, and Tamil nationalism privileges the male, often the upper caste male. So Periyar expresses, he is often known for his opposition to religion, but he at several places expresses his opposition to not just religion, but also nation, language, and caste. Periyar believed that colonialism was a phase which would end, whereas caste was a structure which would sustain. And he believed that the Indian anti-colonial discourse was not enough to dismantle caste. Periyar proposed decentralization and regionalism to ensure political democracy in India. Social democracy, however, needed a new form of a community, a new way of imagining community beyond the nation state. So Periyar uses Dravidian in a sort of a loose sense to mean many things at many times, but always as a challenge to social hierarchy and oppression, including the oppression by the nation state. Periyar believed that modernity had limitations, but also opened up several possibilities for critique. And finally, he believed that the future and not the past is the inspiration. If decolonization can be thought of in these terms, then one could say Periyarist Dravidianism can comfortably sit or comfortably collaborate with this form of a decolonization. But if decolonization is merely a sort of a cultural opposition to the West, then I think Periyarist critique would identify it as something to be challenged along with other discourses of oppression and ideology, if one could use the term. So I think I've kept time and...
Yes, you have. I mean, if you want a couple more minutes, that's fine.
No, I'm done.
Okay. Thank you very much.
I'll have more time for questions. Yeah.
Fantastic. That's grand. We have exactly 20 minutes for questions. We've had one question come in. So while people are thinking about their questions, let me see if I can think out aloud. Between the two, the talks are very, very rich, and there's really lots one could think about. I guess I'll invite you to just expand a little bit on a couple of things that both talks touched on. One is the category of the nation. Is it useful? Is it something that, in fact, we have to potentially set behind us, useful as it might have been for Fanon and others? Is it something that, in a sense, is not recuperable and needs to be set behind? Or is there a way to still hang on to Fanon's nationalitarian dreams, that one could have a nation that is liberated? And along the way, I just wanted you to, maybe this is for Chinnaiah, for Karthik, but Chinnaiah, feel free to jump in. What do we do with anti-colonialism? I mean, you have Fulle's critique of the poison of anti-colonialism, and we clearly see from both talks that that the colonial moment provided a rupture, and it provided a churning that allowed for subaltern voices to emerge and to speak very forcefully. So I just wondered how we now think about anti-colonialism, whether there is a different kind of anti-colonialism that we can think about. Maybe that's enough to be getting on with. So, and also perhaps maybe just touch on the differences and overlaps between Periyar and Dr. Ambedkar, who both emerged in these talks.
Yeah.
Sorry, that's a lot. Do as much as you want or not.
Should I go first?
Yes, please.
Yes. So yeah, I will start. Thank you again, Priya, for this wonderful opportunity, and Karthik, really thank you for enlightening us on Periyar. It's so nice. And yeah, so I will start with your last question. What do we do with this idea of anti-colonial nationalism and also nation state? And if you think about anti-colonial nationalism, as you rightly pointed out, Priya, that colonialism ruptured, and also the rupture opened up spaces for Dalits and other oppressed castes to enter into different institutions and access to education. Education was a tool which provided the language of rights and also means to mobilize. But one thing we should never forget, that the rupture was not intentional to emancipate Dalits, or even for that matter, any oppressed.
Mm-hmm.
Whatever the consequences of unintended consequences of colonialism led to the opening of the projects. So colonialism is not a larger humanitarian project. We should never forget that. Colonialism is a profit-oriented and oppressive state structure which is intended to exploit people, whether it's Dalit or Brahmin. That's when it comes to the politics of race, that's what diaspora experiences, right? When you land in America or in England or wherever, your brown skin is brown. A Tamil Brahmin is equally darker like me. But for a white man, a Brahmin and Dalit look same. For them, it doesn't really matter. So that's why it's very important to see that this glorification of colonialism as the emancipator of Dalits is a wrong view to have. And that's why the rupture is not intentional rupture. It is for their own benefit. These things are open. And in the context of anti-colonial nationalism, we cannot do away with it. In fact, that's what one of the important aspects about anti-colonial nationalism is that the rich texture it produces. We have Phule, we have Ambedkar, we have Periyar, we have Jogendranath Mandal in Bengal. These are all the people in the same colonial public sphere. These are all people who are challenging Nehru and Gandhi and all these people, right? So in this context, what happens is that, these critical conversations are needed. Like, that's why it's very important when, Karthik pointed out that at one level is critiquing Nehru. That doesn't mean that, he equates him with the Savarkar, right? So we need to have that differences, but it's also very important to have a critical dialogue with these figures, like Gandhi, for example. It's very important to point out the, like limitations of Gandhi, especially in the emancipatory project of Dalits. Like, I think, whether we like it or not, like, Gandhi, even, he was anti, Hindu fascism and Hindu communalism. But what happens is that, the way he projected religion as in public itself is one of the reasons why we see today, like Modi can, act like a priest and walk in the, as a prime minister. Like, this is what, it's a very problematic way in which religion has been brought into the public sphere. When, it really helped people like Gandhi to counter, the Hindu right politics in the context of colonialism. But what happens is that, in post-colonial context, that is becoming a very important threat to the very idea of nation state. That's why, like, what happens is that, when you equate nation state with this nation with the state, and, prime minister with the nation, what happens is that, this is where we landed in. And it's very important, like we need to point out, like, for example, the nation state as a category itself is a problematic, because it's imbued with the Hindu-Brahmanical consciousness, particularly in India. And that needs to be cleansed of its Hindu-Brahmanical ideology. Unless we do that, we cannot really counter Hindu fundamentalism in India. That's why, like what you see that, Islamophobia or anti-Dalit or anti-minority legitimacy comes to Hindu communalism precisely because of this Brahmanical way in which the state has been constructed and reconstructed in India. Like, if you go to any ceremonies in India, they think it's okay to do pujas, but not to wear hijab, right? So this is what the problem with the way in which these politics have come. Yes,
Karthik. Thank you. Thanks a lot. Karthik, and then there are a few questions which I'll present, but go ahead, please.
Okay. So excellent. So what to do with this category of nation, right? I mean, very much in the 21st century, there are movements for national self-determination as well, who do deploy, nationalism as, or at least they claim to deploy nationalism as a sort of a progressive, emancipatory, or liberating ideology, right? For instance, we could just have a look at Tibetan nationalism or Tamil nationalism in Sri Lanka, on which I've done some research and so on. So there is, of course, the question of nations without state, which need addressing, and which perhaps cannot be resolved within the existing nation-state paradigm. But what alternatives are they proposing? Right? So that's something I'm a bit curious and a bit skeptical about. Now, as in, for a long time, I was sympathetic to the Tamil nationalism in Sri Lanka. But having said that, I don't think they imagined any sort of alternative to the existing nation-state structure. So, but there are other sort of movements, let's say the Kurds, for instance, who imagine nations without nationalism, right? So a form of confederalist sort of structure where nationalism is not the ideology which is ruling, but a broader form of communitarianism which could rule. But again, as a skeptic, I'm not sure whether how long it can survive or sustain itself in this, in that region particularly, surrounded by Syria, Iran, Iraq, and Turkey. So what I think perhaps I'm more moving closer towards is an idea of states without nations. Because I think states are going to be there for quite some time, and at least for some point of time in the future, they might be sort of some recourse against predatory assaults by the neoliberal regime. Now, this might seem the old third world Marxist thing, but I'm really, I mean, I'm trying to look at it, but I'm unable to get effective alternatives at this point of time. So can we imagine states without nations, where no nation or no tribe claiming to be a nation lays claim to the state, its resources, and its institutions? So that is something I would like to explore. The other thing is about what to do with anti-colonialism, right? Now, I think, Priya, you yourself have pointed out many point of time, colonialism is not just something only the West does, right? As in, now we need to look at a multipolar ways to look at colonialism, which we could probably include let's say Russia as well. We could include China as or India or Pakistan even as new colonial entities. But my question as such is that is to challenge these sort of entities which have emerged after 1950, the time in which, quote unquote, official colonialism was supposed to have ended, the period in which the official colonial, can we oppose them using the same discourse of anti-colonialism, or can we have a sort of a new form of, what shall I say, imagining broader forms of political organization, right? I'm just wondering, as in, if a new way of looking at who constitutes the people and who constitutes the elite can be arrived at, the manner in which some left-wing populist movements are trying to experiment in the Latin American countries. Would that be a challenge to the sort of the regimes which we identify as oppressive or even colonialist in the contemporary world, right? Can we perhaps have a sort of a left populist movement which does not fall into the traps of the programmatic Marxism of the previous century, but is able to address the manner in which the newer forms of structures, power structures resembling maybe colonial ones have emerged in the 21st, right? So that is something perhaps for us to consider, I would think. And regarding Periyar and Ambedkar, now there's just one other point I want to add on to what Chinnaiah said, is that he's absolutely right. I think it is one of Periyar's limitations that he does not address the sort of economic extraction which colonialism did in India. That was perhaps, coming to your question, that was something which Ambedkar addressed, how colonial economy pilfered the Indian subcontinent. Likewise, in fact, there's another thing I would like to add is that, one of the one criticism of Periyar is that he favored the intermediate caste over the Dalits, right? But I think that's actually misplaced, because I think he always favored the Dalits over the intermediate caste, right? Because now there were quite a few intermediate castes in Tamil Nadu who were criminalized by the colonial regime as criminal tribes. And there's an amazing recent book by this academic called Radha Kumar called Police Matters, which talks about the sort of extreme sort of oppression which the so-called criminalized intermediate castes had to undergo under colonial regime. However, Periyar, in Periyar's perspective, I mean, he sided with the Dalits who were oppressed by these intermediate castes. So in a sense, he believed that putting them down by the colonial regime was justified so that the Dalits can progress in society. So, but I think as a broad perspective, this is a bit of an uneasy thing for me to sit with, because the sort of measures which colonialism took to criminalize these castes were extreme. I mean, some could go to the, I mean, some can be called near ethnic cleansing, right? So I don't think, you have to pick a side with one form of extreme oppression to say that you are fighting the oppression of Dalits. It would have been better if a coalition of these sort of communities could have come together under the broad rubric of the Dravidian movement. And it is also one of the reasons why many of these intermediate castes turned right-wing or conservative after independence and began looking at Periyar with, very, very critical lens. That, hey, when we were getting oppressed, you didn't stand by us. So, now, on that note, regarding Periyar and Ambedkar, I would say that Ambedkar had, let's say, huge belief in the Indian constitutional setup, right? And he believed that it was possible to address, perhaps Chinnaiah can correct me if I'm wrong, that it was possible to address the issue of caste within a legal and a constitutional framework. But Periyar, I would say, was an extra constitutionalist. He believed that, sometimes you had to step beyond the constitution for certain social measures to be implemented. So that, I would say, was a big difference. And also that Ambedkar was generally welcoming of the Indian independence when it happened, even though he was strongly critical. I mean, we are familiar with his criticisms of Nehru, Gandhi, and the Congress lot, but as such, he viewed Indian independence to be positive. Periyar, however, was a bit more skeptical, or I would say even cynical, that Indian independence would lead to any progress for the subaltern communities. But I think the interaction between them and the commonalities between them have a lot more to show than these sort of, little points of difference. Because even after independence, there was points where they met and supported each other's demands, especially regarding proportional representation, separate electorates, as well as Ambedkar's conversion to Buddhism. Yeah.
I'm going to, if it's okay with you, I'm going to read out a few questions in one session, and then you take whichever ones you want or don't want. I think we'll just have enough time for a comment from each of you. One question is for Chinnaiah. It says, asks whether similar to Protestantism emerging from Catholicism, whether there's a new form of Hinduism possible as a kind of reformed Hinduism. And can you have Hinduism which rejects the caste system? The next question asks, with the rise of Dalit politics in India, especially with the rise of Kanshi Ram in the 1980s, where do Dalits find themselves vis-a-vis, sorry, the scrolling is a bit difficult. Where do Dalits find themselves vis-a-vis the Indian national project? Habiba Insaf asks, Mr. Professor Jangam mentioned in his talk how anti-caste movements were made blunt as a form of devotion instead of being seen as social revolution. Could you please expand on this? Dr. Gurnam Singh says, decolonization is often associated with the so-called European Enlightenment project and its epistemologies and ontologies, which are problematized as inherently racist. Is an anti-colonial, this is very hard to scroll down, apologies. Is an anti-colonial...
Priya, I'll just paste the question so that it becomes a little easier maybe. I'll put it down in the chat. Does that help?
No, why don't you just read them? Can you read them from where I've left off?
Yeah.
Okay.
Anti-colonial project seeking to decouple European Enlightenment universalism from this past, as Fano hinted at, or to redirect us towards a cultural relativist and plural future where different ways of organizing society and life can be allowed to flourish in a post-nation state future. This is a slightly clunky question, so I'm just going to put this on chat so that everyone has access to it.
Yeah.
And there's one more on Periyar and anti-nationalist support for English.
Hmm.
Do you see that, Stuti? Can you read it?
I'm just having a look. Sorry, could you tell me who's?
Yeah, I'll just read it. How do we reconcile the anti-national support for English as in Periyar's terms, a language of enlightenment and modernity, with critiques of this is so not the easiest way to follow, with critiques of
Priya, if I may suggest, may Chinnaiah answer the two questions first?
Yes, go ahead. And while you read this,
I'll lose track. So
yes, so let me start with the first question, the reformed Hinduism. And is it possible to have a reformed Hinduism which rejects caste and we can have Hinduism? And I think that, Ambedkar, did that experiment. Like where, if you look at read his Annihilation of Caste, one of the important things is that, he was invited by these Arya Samajists who were supposed to be reformists. And, when they read the text of Annihilation of Caste, they refused to engage because it talks about, the problem is that, that's what the fundamental problem about the possibility of reforming Hinduism is that, one thing, it cannot get away with caste. You cannot be a Hindu without caste. That's what I'm telling in the beginning itself. Because Hinduism is a religion which doesn't have any founder. And another important thing you would think is that Hinduism doesn't believe in human equality. It doesn't recognize the humanity of the other. And that's why if you look at least, in religions like Christianity and Islam, though there is a practice of caste, everything, but at least they fundamentally believe that, in the eye of God, everyone is equal. And I think that's one of the reasons why, if you look at African Americans who use the Christianity tradition, Martin Luther King, for that matter, the way in which he invokes the very idea of Christianity and Christian devotion, because the God doesn't discriminate. The God doesn't, another important thing, God suffers for the welfare of the others. And tell me which Hindu text believes in equality? Tell me which Hindu text tells that, every human being is equal and their humanity should be recognized. That's one of the reasons why Ambedkar said it is impossible to, reform Hinduism. And another important thing, as Karthik has pointed out, Ambedkar also, realized the limits of constitutional engagement. That's one of the reasons why in the end he chose path of Buddhism. And that's why, it's a very complicated engagement wherein which basically it's a long road ahead for us. If we really want to have an egalitarian society which doesn't have these fundamental problems of caste, one of the important things is that, it is the responsibility of privileged caste people to destroy the structures of caste. It is not the problem of caste, is not Dalit problem. It is the problem of Brahmin and privileged people who practice and benefit from the caste system, not its victims who have responsibility. That's whenever people think that, whenever you say caste, they think it's a problem of Dalits, it's a problem of OBCs. Oh, it is Dalits didn't, create caste system. It's like racism. That's one of the reasons why when, George Floyd issue has happened and in America, this whole idea of racial, anti-race oppression and all the movement is happening. Why is it that, it is the responsibility of white people to destroy the racial structures, not brown people. We are victims. We are not the perpetuators. So it's very important to see that if you really want to reform Hinduism, it is not, oppressed who should have the response. It is the oppressor who should do that. And that's why for thousands of years, they were not able to do it. That's one of the reasons why Ambedkar was fed up and went into Buddhism. And that's very important. So the other question about, could you, Priya, you said something about Fabio, who said about Fabio, I remember the name,
okay.
But about anti-caste, something like that.
Stuti, can you see a question by Fabio? Maybe if there's Fabio still there, they can speak.
I think it was Habiba's question that we were thinking about. Would you like me to read that question again?
Yes, please. Yeah.
Professor Jangam mentioned in his talk how anti-caste movements were made blunt as a form of devotion instead of being seen as social revolution. I am curious to know more on this. Can Professor Jangam kindly expand on this? Thank you.
That's right. Like, one of the important, like, if I can tell you from South India, I don't know whether you're familiar or not, someone called Pothuluri Veerabrahmam, who was a very important Shaivite saint. And he taught, he preached against it comes from the Sudra background and the early modern time. One of the important thing is that, he contended Brahmanism and Brahmanical obscurantism as a very important way to preach against practice of caste and also the Brahmanical rituals. And now what you see is that in the course of time, he has been made part of this Hindu devotion structures. Like even for that matter, like people like Yogi Vemana. And that's what, like, early modern, before the encounter of the colonialism, one of the important thing is that, that was, I think, a kind of a revolutionary era in which at one level, Indian economy is flourishing as a global economy. But at other level, what you see is that there was a complete, social rupture in terms of anti-caste movements across India. Like, I'm talking from the vantage point of coming from South India, particularly from Telugu land, where I've seen the entire Christian missionary conversion uses the anti-caste frame and also anti-caste networks as a very important to spread. And for example, I'm reading now about American Baptist missions in southern India. They just use the early, anti-caste movements as a very important to convert these people. So that's what happened. Like, the way in which this whole idea of, the radical anti-caste movements gets absorbed into religious movements is the danger through which basically they have been blunted across historical periods. That's why, Jainism, for example. Today, Jainism stands for what? Nothing. Jainism was the most radical philosophy when it was there. Like if you look at the history of early medieval South India, the Jain temples were the centers which actually created alternative public sphere away from the Brahmanical temples. But now they are nowhere. They come in the form of Amit Shah now, right? That is what is happening.
Thank you, Chinnaiah. I'll just read the two questions that are remaining and then hand over to Karthik. I think the question by Dr. Gurnam Singh asks whether we can decouple Enlightenment universalism from racism, as Fanon hints at, or are we redirected towards a cultural relativist and plural future, which can all flourish in a nation state? And then the question specifically for you, Karthik, Katie asks, thank you so much to both of you, such a brilliant seminar. A question for Karthik: how do we reconcile the anti-nationalist support for English, as in Periyar's term, as a language of enlightenment and modernity, with critiques of the continued coloniality of English and critiques of neoliberal discourses of English that construct it as a tool for individual betterment, while obscuring how practices of English are not equally valued? So I'll just hand that to you, Karthik.
Yeah. Okay, so first I'll address the question of Dr. Gurnam Singh. So I actually think that the European Enlightenment can be decoupled from its racist and colonialist past. In fact, Shankar Muthu has discussed this at detail in his Enlightenment Against Empire. And in fact, I actually, I'm just reminded of a joke I was having with a friend a few days back that, when we were just saying, if Enlightenment is responsible for contemporary racism, then maybe decolonization is responsible for Amit Shah and Rahul Shiv Shankar of times now. So anyway, but that's just a joke. And no, I actually have a little bit of problems with the term cultural relativism, and I actually think Fanon also has a issue with cultural relativism, and which he makes clear in Towards an African Revolution and his writings on negritude as well. But I seriously think that there is something to salvage in the idea of universalism, right? But this needs to be complemented from other voices from all across the world for it to be a true and genuine universalism. It can't be a universalism that is, located only in Europe. Then it will be something like the, what shall I say, Vedantic idea that the universalism is embodied in the body of the upper caste, right? But for universalism to be genuine, it has to be, well, universal. So I seriously think that one, it is possible to disentangle European Enlightenment from the traces of racism and colonialist thinking. Two, that universalism is workable by thinking with and thinking beyond the European tradition. Because if I remember correctly, Fanon concludes the Wretched of the Earth by saying that we need to build a new humanity for ourselves and for Europe as well, right? So he does not discard Europe completely. He is in fact complaining that Europeans have not lived up to the legacy that they claimed to represent. So I mean, this is something which would take a long time to debate, but I hope this short answer suffices. Now, on Periyar and the English question. Okay, so over here, I would say that the coloniality of English has been challenged by the English speakers in former colonies itself. So I don't think any one group, especially the British, can lay complete claims over the English language anymore. I think English language is for everyone to use and abuse as we see fit. So, but I completely agree that there is a neoliberal discourse that views English as a tool for individual betterment, and often this assists the already privileged. But I would just like to highlight that there are sort of two sorts of differing views on this. One is a critique which says that English education is largely, in India particularly, is largely available only to the privileged caste and only to the elites, and therefore it acts as a sort of a gatekeeping mechanism to keep out the underprivileged and the lesser privileged. Having said that, there is also another critique which is coming from the Dalit and the Bahujan standpoint, that having an access to English education enables these sort of communities, individuals from these communities, Dalits and Bahujans, to be part of a broader market than they were earlier part of, right? So the argument is that, in fact, even in the wake of the recent Marathi Language Day celebrations in the Maharashtrian state, there were many Dalit writers and thinkers who were arguing that expecting the subaltern communities to just study and protect and preserve the Marathi language while the elites study English and move across India and across the world seems to be just another form of keeping the subaltern communities in their place. So I would say that in the current scenario, the sort of two-language policy which is followed by the state of Tamil Nadu, which promotes the teaching of English and Tamil, right? So where you can choose to have English as your primary language and Tamil as your secondary, or Tamil as primary and English as secondary, can be a way forward for several other states in India. So the option is there, but there's also the possibility for people from different backgrounds to have access to the language and gain mobility. So I guess this requires a sort of a broader form of institutional makeover.
Thank you. I'm conscious we are well out of time. I guess somebody has very much wants to answer the question, both of you, about Kanshiram and the future of Dalits in 2022. I remember reading that question, but I can't quite find it again. So I don't know, perhaps Chinnaiah, do you just want to talk about, sort of Dalit futures in 2022, and we can use that to wrap up?
Yes, Dalit futures in 2022, like, one thing is that, the future of any oppressed community should not be bounded to the electoral outcomes of any particular party. And these emancipatory politics are long-term visions and long-term, struggles. Like what we see in terms of Ambedkar, for example, till 1990s, Ambedkar was not an important figure. But after 1990s, with the anti-Mandal politics and the way in which Dalit and social justice movements have come, Ambedkar now is a very important defining figure of modern India, and no one can ignore him. And another important thing is that, to flourish the democratic politics in India, it's very important to have an anti-caste perspective as an important way to democratize. And if you really want to challenge the structures of power and structures of discrimination, structures of violence across, structures across India, one of the important ways to do is that, unless you challenge Brahmanism, you cannot build democracy in India. And the Hindu fundamentalism thrives on this, whole idea of Brahmanism as the nation, and that needs to be redone, particularly challenged. I think Periyar and Ambedkar and others are very important figures who will really provide us the intellectual tools to democratize India and protect its secular and plural ethos.
That's a very good note on which to end. This was extraordinarily rich, Karthik and Chinnaiah. I think you have provided us, both have provided us the tools to think about decolonization differently and pull it away from some of the less benign uses to which it is being put. I was waving when Karthik was talking this grim book by Sai Deepak, called India That is Bharat, which claims to be a decolonizing account of India. And it was endorsed by people who I think should have known better. But it is testimony to how powerful, the misuse and abuse of decolonization can be, and how wonderfully corrective anti-caste discourse and scholarship is. So I'm going to end by saying this is an extraordinary seminar. We've had amazing attendance. And I know that work like this takes generosity on your part. And I want to thank you again, Chinnaiah and Karthik. Thank you very much indeed. And we will continue this conversation.
Thank you. Thank you, Priya and the team, and Jai Bhim to you all. Thank
Jai
you.
Bhim.
Thank you all. Thank you all for inviting us, and had an absolutely great time. Thank you so much.
We had a great time too. Thank you. Bye, everybody. Thank you for